My parents refused to help pay for college. Now they want to borrow money from me. After years of refusing to help with my education, my parents are now asking me for money to pay for my brother's extravagant wedding. This time, I'm putting my foot down. I'm a 34-year-old web developer, and compared to my family, I make significantly more. My mom used to teach art in a small local school, and my dad owns a modest hardware shop in our town. Then, there's my younger brother David, who's 30. We haven't spoken in 5 years, and it's mainly because he's selfish, spoiled, and feels like the world owes him everything. That attitude started in childhood and never went away because our parents never did anything to correct him. For a long time, I tolerated David's behavior, but 5 years ago, things reached a breaking point. I had just moved into a cozy apartment, which I was really proud of, and I wanted to host Christmas dinner that year. It was a special moment for me since I was finally in a place of my own, and I went out of my way to make the dinner nice. But, true to form, David ruined it. He showed up with his new girlfriend, and the whole evening, he didn't stop making rude comments about my apartment. He criticized how small it was, said it was in a bad part of town, and just kept going on about how much better his girlfriend's place was. She came from money and apparently lived in a huge house. David spent most of the night bragging about how wealthy she was, how big her house was, and how much better off he was compared to me. It was unbearable. I tried to stay calm, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I finally snapped and told David that, unlike him, I was paying for my apartment all by myself without any help from anyone, especially our parents. And if he had such high standards, he was more than welcome to leave. Of course, David and his girlfriend got offended and left immediately. That was the last time we spoke. And honestly, I don't miss him. My parents tried to get us to reconcile over the years, but I have no interest in having a relationship with him. I only tolerated him before because of our parents, but that night was my breaking point. Fast forward 5 years, and recently I learned through the grapevine that David is engaged to that same girlfriend. They're planning a huge wedding, of course, because nothing with David is ever simple. My parents, in a move that completely baffles me, offered to help cover some of the costs, specifically the venue and decorations. This is despite the fact that David's fiance's family is far wealthier than ours. I don't know what my parents were thinking, but they made the offer, and now they're stuck with it. As expected, David's wedding plans are way out of my parents' budget. The venue and decorations alone are going to cost a small fortune, and my parents, who have always been a bit too eager to keep up appearances, are now panicking because they can't afford it. That's when they came to me, asking for help. They approached me a few days ago, telling me that they were struggling to cover the wedding expenses, and asked if I could lend them some money to help out. Even though we've had a relatively good relationship in recent years, I immediately said no. And here's why. This goes back to what happened years ago, when I was just finishing high school and preparing for college. At the time, my parents told me that they wouldn't be helping me with any of my college expenses. I was shocked, to say the least. My parents had always been supportive, or so I thought, so this came out of nowhere for me. They explained that now that I had turned 18, it was time for me to start fending for myself, just like they had done when they were my age. They went on to tell me that when they were younger, their parents hadn't been able to support them financially, and they had to figure everything out on their own. They said it built character and independence, and they wanted me to have the same experience. I was frustrated, but what could I do? They didn't have any money set aside for my education, not for me or for David. They expected us to work and pay for college ourselves, just like they had. The thing is, I was studying a pretty tough course, and I knew I wouldn't be able to juggle a job and maintain good grades at the same time. College isn't cheap, and no matter how hard I worked, it wouldn't have been enough to cover all my costs. So I asked my parents if we could take out a student loan, but they refused. They said they didn't believe in borrowing money and that taking out loans was a bad idea. At one point, I even suggested asking some relatives for help, but my parents were horrified by the idea. They said it was embarrassing to borrow money from family and that we should never rely on others like that. We had several heated arguments about it, but in the end, they stood their ground. They were adamant that borrowing money was against their values. I was left with no choice but to turn to my grandparents, who helped me take out a student loan so I could go to college. That's how I managed to get through school. I was angry with my parents for a long time because of how they handled the situation, but eventually, I let it go. However, just because I forgave them doesn't mean I've forgotten. Meanwhile, David never had to face any of this. He didn't even bother going to college because he always had a backup plan. Either take over my dad's store or marry rich. And of course, he's doing the latter now. So, when my parents came to me asking for help with his wedding, it brought back all those old feelings. I reminded them of what they had told me years ago, how borrowing money was against their values, and how they had refused to take out a loan to help me with my education. Suddenly, when it came to David's wedding, those values didn't seem to matter anymore. It was incredibly convenient that they were willing to bend their principles now, but back then, when it was about my future, they wouldn't budge. I wasn't about to let them forget that. I told them I wasn't going to lend them any money and reminded them of everything they had said to me back when I was starting college. They were clearly shocked that I remembered it all so well, and they didn't have much to say in response. After a long, awkward silence, they left without arguing. I thought that was the end of it, but soon after, I started getting calls from a bunch of relatives. Apparently, my parents had been telling everyone that I had changed after making money and was now treating them poorly. The relatives accused me of humiliating my parents and said I was being ungrateful for everything my parents had done for me. I don't see it that way at all. My parents made a choice years ago, and now they're facing the consequences of that choice. I'm not holding anything over their heads, but I also don't think it's fair that I should bail them out now, especially after how they treated me when I needed their help the most. If they want to stick to their principles, they should apply them equally, not just when it suits them. After standing my ground on something I felt was completely unfair, I decided to cut off communication with my parents. If they had a problem with what I said, they should have confronted me directly, instead of complaining to the rest of the family behind my back. I didn't feel like explaining myself to anyone else either. If they couldn't see my side, then I had nothing more to say. Besides, I wasn't even invited to David's wedding, so I didn't think it was my responsibility to help fund it in the first place. For the past few days, I haven't spoken to my parents or any other family members, and honestly, I've been fine with that. I don't feel like I've done anything wrong. However, 2 days ago, my parents showed up at my house again. This time, they were visibly upset. They told me that because of me, they had been uninvited from David's wedding. I was confused, as I hadn't spoken to my brother at all, so how could I have caused this? Apparently, when my parents told David that they wouldn't be able to cover all the wedding expenses and that they would need help from his fiancee's family, he lost his temper. David pressured them to figure out a way to get the money, as going to his fiancee's family for financial help would make our family look bad. He didn't want to appear incapable of paying for his own wedding, especially in front of wealthier in-laws. I get it, he was right to be upset. If my parents weren't sure they could afford it, they shouldn't have promised anything. David's typically spoiled and entitled, but this time, I don't think he was entirely wrong. My parents' inability to cover their promise was embarrassing, and it would make them look bad. To be honest, I think David and his fiancée should have paid for their wedding themselves, especially considering her family is wealthy. But, since my parents had made the commitment, they should have seen it through. I told my parents that this was on them, not me. They made the promise, and they're the ones who put themselves in this situation. I wasn't the one who committed to paying for David's wedding, and I definitely wasn't the one who made them look bad. It wasn't my responsibility to bail them out. I didn't make the mess, and I certainly wasn't going to clean it up. Uninviting them from the wedding was probably an overreaction on David's part, but given his history, I wasn't all that surprised. He's always been like this, entitled and quick to anger when things don't go his way. My parents are the ones who enabled that behavior, So I wasn't about to take the blame for the consequences of their parenting. But my parents wouldn't hear it. They kept insisting that if I had just loaned them the money instead of holding on to old grudges, none of this would have happened. They argued that I was being petty, and they were in this predicament because of me. I thought it was incredibly unfair to put the blame on me when they were the ones who made poor financial decisions. I told them to leave. They did, but not without more guilt-tripping and accusations. Since then, they've continued to harass me about how I've ruined everything for them. Even worse, the rest of the family has turned against me too. Now, I'm being painted as the selfish and heartless one for refusing to help out. Frankly, I don't see what I've done wrong here. I'm being accused of things that aren't even my responsibility. Should I really feel guilty for not wanting to pay for a wedding I wasn't even invited to? For declining to bail out my parents after they made a promise they couldn't keep? A couple of days ago, I made a decision. I've gone no contact with my entire family. At this point, the drama isn't worth my time or energy. My dad's side and my mom's side of the family, who usually don't get along, are suddenly united against me. The only people who seem to be on my side are my grandparents, who have always been supportive. They've tried to keep the peace, but even they're growing tired of all the drama. It's ironic, in a way. My family has had plenty of disagreements in the past, but now that I'm the common enemy, they're more united than ever. At least I've achieved something positive for them by giving them a shared target to blame. I've blocked them all now, and have no interest in getting pulled back into their nonsense. I don't need that kind of negativity in my life. One of the comments on my original post suggested that maybe the real reason my family hates me so much is jealousy. I think that's a valid point. I don't want to sound arrogant, but I am doing better than most of them financially. I've always made my own way, and my career is going well. Growing up, many family members told me I was wasting my time pursuing my passion for technology, advising me to just get a business degree and take over my dad's hardware store. They believed that was the safer path. But I stuck to my own path, and now I'm a successful developer. It feels like my success is something they can't stand. Many of my cousins are struggling, and their parents seem to resent me for not following the same traditional route. It's frustrating, because I thought families were supposed to celebrate each other's successes. Instead, they seem to resent me for it. My parents are probably taking pleasure in seeing the rest of the family gang up on me. According to them, I'm the one responsible for getting them uninvited from David's wedding. I still don't understand how that's my fault. We haven't spoken since they came over to blame me, but my grandparents have told me that even they are no longer speaking to my parents. That says a lot to me. My grandparents have helped them out so many times in the past, and this is how they're repaid? In a strange way, I'm relieved I didn't help my parents out with their request for money. They've taken so much for granted, and I know if I had loaned them the money, they would have conveniently forgotten it later. It's time they learned a lesson, and while it's unfortunate that it's happening through David and the wedding, maybe it'll make them realize how much they've messed up. At the end of the day, I don't feel guilty. David's behavior, my parents' entitlement, and the family's jealousy are not my burdens to carry anymore. I'm moving on, and if that makes me selfish in their eyes, so be it. After the whirlwind of emotions from Catherine's surprise visit, I spent the next few days replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. Part of me was still skeptical about her intentions. After all, we hadn't spoken for 5 years, and it felt strange that she would suddenly want to make amends. But another part of me, the part that longed for a family connection, however flawed, was curious. Could she really be sincere? In the days leading up to the wedding, I found myself oscillating between excitement and dread. I would glance at my phone, half expecting another call from her, perhaps to plead for my attendance or clarify something. The silence was deafening, and in those moments the old resentment flared up again, reminding me of why we had distanced ourselves in the first place. But then I'd think about her words, how she seemed genuinely remorseful, and it would quell some of that anger. I took long walks during those days to clear my mind. The weather was shifting from the humid heat of summer to a cooler, crisper autumn. I watched as leaves began to change colors, vibrant reds and yellows mingling with the remnants of summer greens. The transformation of the landscape mirrored my internal struggle. Change can be beautiful, but it can also be disorienting. Eventually, I decided to talk to my grandparents about the wedding. They had always been a source of wisdom and stability in my life, even when my own immediate family felt chaotic. I sat down with them one evening, the three of us huddled in their cozy living room with the scent of fresh-baked cookies wafting from the kitchen. "Are you planning to attend the wedding?" Grandma asked, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I don't know, Grandma. I'm just torn," I replied, leaning back in my chair. Catherine's actions hurt me deeply. But she seems to be trying to change. I don't want to hold on to grudges forever. That feels so exhausting. Grandpa nodded, his face lined with years of experience. "It's not easy to forgive, especially when the wounds run deep. But remember, people can change. Sometimes it takes a significant life event to make someone realize their past mistakes. It sounds like this wedding is that for her." I took a deep breath, contemplating his words. What if it's just a facade? What if she's trying to manipulate me into giving her what she wants? I can't just let my guard down so easily. My grandmother reached out, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "It's wise to be cautious, but sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. You don't have to jump in with both feet. You can test the waters. You can attend and see how things go. If it feels wrong, you can always leave." That made sense. I didn't have to commit to anything permanent just yet. I could go to the wedding, observe, and if things felt off, I could always excuse myself. After talking it through with them, I decided that I would attend. It would mean stepping out of my comfort zone, but maybe that was what I needed to do. The day of the wedding arrived, and I found myself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie. I decided to wear a simple black suit, wanting to strike a balance between looking respectable and not drawing too much attention to myself. As I looked at my reflection, I couldn't shake the nervous feeling bubbling in my stomach. What would it feel like to see Catherine after everything that had happened? I arrived at the venue early, wanting to take everything in before the ceremony began. It was an outdoor garden, a beautiful setting with fairy lights twinkling above and flowers blooming in every direction. Despite the beauty around me, I felt a sense of unease. I scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces from my childhood. My grandparents were already there, and they waved me over. "Hey, how are you holding up?" Grandpa asked, concern etched on his face. "I'm okay, just a little anxious," I admitted, rubbing the back of my neck. "I just hope everything goes smoothly. I really want this day to be special for her." As we stood there, I caught sight of Catherine in the distance. She looked radiant in her wedding dress, the fabric flowing elegantly around her. It was surreal seeing her like this. She looked so happy and at peace. But I also noticed the slight tremble in her hands, the way she bit her lip as she spoke with her fiancé. "Remember," Grandma whispered, "this is her day. Just be there for her." I nodded, taking a deep breath as the ceremony began. I took my place beside Catherine, and as we walked down the aisle together, I could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was about healing, about starting anew. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The officiant spoke warmly about love and commitment, and as I watched Catherine exchange vows with her fiancé, I felt a strange sense of pride. I hadn't expected to feel so emotional, but seeing her commit to this new life, this new chapter, filled me with hope. After the ceremony, there was a brief reception, and I found myself sitting at a table with my grandparents. They were chatting amicably with some distant relatives, but my mind kept drifting back to Catherine. I spotted her laughing with her friends, and for a moment, I couldn't help but smile. When she finally approached our table, she looked radiant. "Hey, I'm so glad you made it," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "You look amazing, by the way." "Thank you, I'm just so relieved everything went well." She paused, looking down for a moment. "I wanted to thank you again for walking me down the aisle. It meant a lot to me." I could see the sincerity in her eyes, and it stirred something within me. "I'm really proud of you, Catherine. I know it hasn't been easy for either of us, but I hope this is a new beginning for you. She smiled, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. It is. I've been doing a lot of thinking, especially about our relationship. I want to make things right, you know? I know it'll take time, but I'm willing to put in the effort. Time is what it takes, I replied cautiously. I'm not sure if I can just forgive and forget right away, but I'm open to trying. Catherine nodded, a look of understanding on her face. That's all I ask for. Just a chance. As the evening wore on, I found myself loosening up. The music played softly in the background and laughter filled the air. It felt nice to be surrounded by people who were genuinely happy. My grandparents shared stories about their own wedding, and it reminded me of the importance of family and connection. At one point, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The night sky was filled with stars and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. As I stood there, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Catherine. Mind if I join you? She asked, her voice soft. Not at all, I replied, turning to face her. It's nice out here. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sound of laughter from inside drifting through the air. Finally, she spoke up. You know, I've really missed having you in my life. It's been lonely, especially with everything going on with our parents. They've always made everything so complicated. I know what you mean. It's been hard for me too, I admitted. I wish things were different, but I think we can start to change that. Catherine looked up at the stars, her expression contemplative. I want to be better, for myself and for you. I don't want to repeat the mistakes I made in the past. Her honesty touched me. It's not going to happen overnight, but I believe you can do it. We just need to keep communicating and working on it. I'd like that, she said, a smile breaking across her face. I want to have a real relationship with you, not just one based on our past. As we stood there, it felt as if a weight had been lifted. The tension that had lingered between us for so long seemed to dissipate in the cool night air. I realized then that while our family might be dysfunctional, we still had the power to create our own narrative. Eventually, we made our way back inside, and I found myself enjoying the reception more than I had anticipated. Catherine's fiancé mingled with guests, and I could see how happy he made her. It was a refreshing change to see her smile so freely. At one point, Catherine pulled me aside again. I wanted to introduce you to my friends, she said. They're really important to me, and I want you to know the people who are in my life now. I appreciated that gesture. Meeting her friends felt like a step toward understanding her new life, and I wanted to embrace this new version of her. The group of friends was welcoming, filled with laughter and light-hearted banter. They seemed genuinely fond of Catherine, which made me hopeful that she had found her place in the world. As the night wore on, the dancing began. I watched as Catherine twirled around the dance floor, her laughter infectious. It was a beautiful sight, one that reminded me of how far we had come. We were slowly healing, and the journey wasn't over yet. Later in the evening, as the cake was being cut, I noticed Catherine's eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I moved closer, concerned. What's wrong? It's just, I never thought I'd have this day, she said, wiping a tear away. After everything that happened, I didn't think I'd get to celebrate with anyone, especially not with family. Thank you for being here. I reached out, placing my hand on her shoulder. You deserve this, Catherine. No one can take away what you've accomplished today. You're starting a new chapter, and I'm proud of you. We shared a moment, and in that instant, it felt like we had crossed a bridge that had seemed insurmountable just a few months prior. The day wound down, and as we prepared to say our goodbyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning for us. When I left, I glanced back at the venue, the lights flickering like stars against the backdrop of the night sky. The journey ahead would be challenging, but we were willing to try. As I drove home, I reflected on the events of the day, the laughter, the tears, the healing. Maybe, just maybe, it was possible for families to mend. A week after the wedding, I received a message from Catherine. It was simple yet filled with warmth. Thank you for everything. I'm excited for what's next for us. It was a start, and for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about our future. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. See you next time.